anyone in the waiting room, but I'll keep bringing in any tricklers.
Yeah, they can catch up with us.
Yep.
So basically my job is easy anyway. I just welcome everyone, and I'm glad you could join us this evening. As a reminder, we will be having our book discussion, and then those of you who wish to can stay and help us come up with a short list of books to consider for next year's programming. And with that, Sarah, is there anything that you need to tell us about any technical stuff tonight, or just the usual raise your hand if you want to talk?
I'd say hand raising is always good. I did not mute everyone today because I know that can get a little iffy with people trying to unmute themselves. So if you hear any clanking in your neck of the woods, I would recommend putting yourself on mute. But I have done it so that you can do that for yourself, so that you don't have to wait for the little pop-up from me in order to speak.
Okay, so we would appreciate any distracting background noise to be muted. Barking dogs, screaming kids, whatever.
I should stop clicking my pen.
Oh yeah, that could be annoying after a
Mhm.
while, yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn it right over to Joan, and let's dive right in.
Okay, I'm going to introduce Gresh, who most of you know anyway, but I've got some nice background on him. But before that, I want to just give you a little background, a little bio on our real author, Erik Larson. He is the author of 8 books, 6 of which became New York Times bestsellers. The Splendid and the Vile is his latest book. And 9/11 led the author to a book about the Blitz when he and his wife moved from Seattle to Manhattan. And what he said was that the vivid, traumatic violation of Holman City brought him to the German air campaign. And how did anyone endure 57 consecutive nights of bombing, followed by 6 months of worsening raids? He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, received his master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. You might have read him. He's been a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal as well as Time Magazine. He now lives in Manhattan with his wife and is keeping up with his 3 daughters in far-flung locations and professions. And to our wonderful book club leader tonight, Gresh Lattimore. He graduated from Sewanee, the University of the South, in 1964, went on to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, where he earned a PhD in post-World War II German affairs. During his time at Fletcher, he volunteered for service in the Navy and spent 3 years on active duty aboard the attack aircraft carrier, the USS Coral Sea. And he also met Nancy, his wife, on a blind date at Tufts. After a 30-year career in small business lending, he retired in 2005. And for the past 16 years, he has volunteered with the VA's hospice team, serving on the boards of the Lexington Veterans Association and the Town Celebration Committee, and chaired the Advocates for Tufts ROTC. Thanks to his devoted service to the ROTC program at Tufts, and his service with his Fletcher class of 65, he was honored with the Tufts Alumni Association's Distinguished Service Award in 2020. He lives happily in Lexington with his beautiful wife, Nancy. He didn't put that in there, but I thought that'd be a great plug for him for later. 54 years married, and their 11-and-a-half-year-old golden retriever, Sonny. Their son, Mark, lives in New Jersey with his 2 teenage sons. And it's my pleasure to turn the book discussion over to Gresh at this time. So Gresh, thank you for being our leader tonight.
Thank you, Joan. Yes, and thank you for that nice introduction. And also, you already have brought forward Erik Larson, the author of this. And the thing that struck me most about him, because I've done some, everything's online, so you just go online. And he has his own website if you're interested. But he takes delight in the minutia of research. And so when you read a vignette that he has in quotes here, it came from somewhere. It was really said, it was really done, and it was described by the person that he quotes. So he's just a meticulous guy. And actually, it's made me aware of many things about the opening of World War II from the British point of view that I really had never thought about. To me, it had always been, okay, Churchill becomes prime minister, and things happen more poorly in Europe. Oh, but America gets attacked, and now America is helping with Lend-Lease and things like that, and boom, we're off. But it's much more convoluted, as you might imagine. I don't know if any of you are watching the Crossing the Atlantic PBS series, which tells of the Princess Royale of Norway. She and the royal family have fled once the Nazis invade the country. And she strikes up a relationship, a very close relationship with FDR. And if you look at or listen to Crossing the Atlantic, it appears that she thought up the idea of Lend-Lease and made possible FDR's use of the example of your neighbor's house is burning, and so you take your hose, your little garden hose, and help put it out. And these all, you get the idea from Crossing the Atlantic that she was so instrumental in this. It's unclear. I would like Erik Larson to look into it, but it's still very interesting. So anyway, I think the best, if you haven't read it, it's not a quick read, but it is a page turner. I mean, it's a tome and pretty heavy. I'm going to read just briefly from the introduction in the book itself, because it's so good. And, you know, why reinvent the wheel? On Winston Churchill's first day as prime minister, Hitler invaded Holland and Belgium. Poland and Czechoslovakia had already fallen, and the Dunkirk evacuation was just 2 weeks away. For the next 12 months, Hitler would wage a relentless bombing campaign, killing 45,000 Britons, 30,000 of them Londoners, 30,000 Londoners, and destroying 2 million homes. It was up to Churchill to hold the country together and persuade FDR that Britain was a worthy ally, that she was willing to fight to the end. So all of this unfolds, telling how Churchill taught the British people the art of being fearless. It is a story of political brinkmanship and also an intimate domestic drama set against the background of Churchill's prime ministerial country house, Chequers, and his wartime residence, Dightley, where Churchill and his entourage go when the moon is brightest and the bombing threat is highest. Drawing on a wealth of untapped sources, including recently declassified files, intelligence reports, and personal diaries, Larson provides a new lens on London's darkest year through the day-to-day experience of Churchill and his family. And I think that succinctly tells what the book is about. Of course, to my mind, Churchill is just a magnificent fellow. I mean, I think most of you know his background. He comes from this dysfunctional British-American couple, Lord Randolph Churchill, who dies of syphilis. He's not really loved by his American mom, does poorly in school, gets packed off to become a soldier at Sandhurst, and then goes to South Africa because this was the Boer War time at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, becomes essentially a correspondent, and that launches a political career because he's well connected, and he just seems to go from glory to glory, except when he becomes a minister in the World War I cabinet, and his great tactical idea of a Normandy-like invasion called Gallipoli in Turkey turns out to be a cropper. And so he goes into the political hinterland, and not being needing money, he goes ahead and becomes a prolific writer, a history writer in the 30s, as well as raising an increasing alarm that the Germans under Nazis tyranny are a threat to the world. And so that brings us to May of 1940. That's May of 1940, when he is made prime minister. And of course, for, of those who know a little bit about Churchill, it seems he had always a cigar in one hand and a brandy in the other. I mean, this guy drank around the clock, and it didn't seem to faze him. So unfortunately, his son Randolph does become a dysfunctional alcoholic and has all sorts of problems in his own way. But Churchill comes to power, and because of all this journalism that he and history writing that he has provided and become part of, he is able to give stirring speeches that are so riveting that Goebbels over in Berlin is telling the Germans that if you listen to these speeches, it's an act of treason. So obviously he was able to inspire the British people at a time when they basically stood alone against Nazi tyranny. And of course, Hitler was planning an invasion of Britain. Well, let's go back. First, it seemed that Hitler, like the Kaiser, had a soft spot in his heart for the British, fellow Aryans, if you will, and really didn't want to go to war with them. However, he was unable to get anybody, to get the attention of the British government to strike a deal like this. And therefore, Hitler started the bombing campaign. And you have all sorts of illustrations, verbal in the book about how that was fared by the people. I like during the Blitz when Buckingham Palace finally was bombed and the Queen said something to the effect that, well, she was really relieved that the palace had been attacked because now it gave her credibility with the West End of London, where they were taking the worst hits. And so, but Winston is just irascible. He always, despite his drinking, he sleeps late in the morning, but that's because he stayed up half the night. He usually gets to bed about 2 a.m, and then he doesn't surface until, 10, 11 o'clock the next morning. And this is his cycle. And you see all the things that he brought to bear. He really rallied the British people and gave them hope. This was even before Pearl Harbor. He even gave them great hope that they could sustain themselves despite the odds. And the odds were pretty bad at that point. So I'm going to read you a couple of my favorite vignettes, because this is a volume of vignettes. The last time I led a discussion, we were talking about MacArthur and Truman and how Truman, in a 6-month period, came to the decision to fire MacArthur. It cascades one after another of a story about this happening and that happening. So let me tell you the two that I liked. One of the characters here is Harry Hawkins, and you all know that he was FDR's man on the spot. Now, if you look at Atlantic Crossing on PBS, Harry Hopkins is rather dapper. He looks like, you know, a typical civil servant. But in reality, he was a disheveled, sickly looking guy who was always smoking cigarettes. So I think that's interesting. But anyway, FDR sends him over to Britain after Churchill comes to power to sort of check him out and see what's happening and be the eyes and ears for a president who is wheelchair bound. So Harry then is feted throughout Britain because Churchill wants him to take a good picture of Britain back with him to present to FDR, because he looks at America as someone who can help the British withstand the onslaught of the Nazi military might. So at one hotel, he had endless dinners. And at this dinner, he had, you know, being the honored guest, he has to give a speech. So this is on page 362. Hopkins stood and first made a tilt or two to the British Constitution in general and the irrepressible Prime Minister in particular. Then he turned to face Churchill. Quote, "I suppose you wish to know what I am going to say to President Roosevelt on my return," he said. This was an understatement. Churchill was desperate to know how well his courtship of Hopkins was progressing, and what indeed he would tell the president. "Well," Hopkins said, "I'm going to quote you one verse from that book of books, in the truth of which Mr. Johnson's mother and my own Scottish mother were brought up." Hopkins drops his voice to a near whisper and recited a passage from the Bible book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God." Then softly he added, "even to the end." Churchill wept. So you can imagine perhaps how meaningful that was to Churchill to know that this emissary of FDR was going back with a good story to tell. The other one that I want to quote to you is on page 487. And this has to do, as soon as Churchill finds out about the attack on Pearl Harbor, the sneak attack by the Japanese, and it says here that later that night, Churchill at last retired to his room. "Being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation," he wrote, "I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful," because he saw in our declaration of war against Japan that now the United States was going to be in war. And he worried, it says a little later there, that he worried that we might focus our attempt, our war effort in the Pacific but graciously, the Nazis declared war on us the next day. And so now Churchill knew that he would be able to get the strength of the United States behind his war effort as well. So I hadn't thought, Pearl Harbor for Americans is, this wake-up call to unify the nation and take us to victory in the Pacific, whereas there in Europe, some other people were thinking other thoughts. So I find The Splendid and the Vile a very compelling story, a very factual story, and just filled with endless vignettes that are closely documented, because you see all the quotes and all the footnotes that are part of the back of the volume. And it just is so well written that I'm quite enamored of Larson. I'm going to go back. He wrote another book about the sinking of the Lusitania, and I'm going to read that one again. So that's pretty much what I have. I mean, most of us know quite a bit about World War II, and this is just zeroing in on that first year of Churchill's premiership and the developing relationship with FDR after Pearl Harbor. So, yes, go ahead.
I got it. Oh, good.
Whoops.
Don't you do that? I called Sue. Sue who?
Judy,
Yes.
Judy, I'm glad you got on, but could you mute yourself while Gresh is
Oh, sorry.
talking? Thank you.
Lower left. Okay, so that in a nutshell is The Splendid and the Vile. And I would now enjoy some of your comments, critique, impressions, because there's really one thing after another. Richard.
Just one thing that may or may not add to it. Those of you who knew Val Hoffman, who used to be a head guide, she grew up in London as a child, and she lived through the bombing, and she was also one of those children that was put on the child trains, I think they were called. So when you could get her talking, well, actually you could always get her talking, but she would then talk about what it was like and what her parents felt about Churchill and about Roosevelt coming in. And she said she was just old enough to remember all of that happening. So as I say, if you could get her going and to talk about it, and she was old enough to really know who the politicians were and what they were doing. But to hear her talk about the Blitz was just incredible, just incredible. And the fact that the King and Queen stayed.
Yes, in London, right, yeah. So how, the rest of you, how have you found it? Yes, Mary.
When I was reading it, I thought this is what real leadership is like. Someone who puts the people's interests first, who puts the country first, and then goes ahead and does the right thing. And I'm glad that you mentioned Harry Hopkins. I had never thought much about Harry, but in that scene when he with Roosevelt goes up to Scapa Flow and he's dangling between the two boats, and Churchill puts his head over the side and says, "Harry, that's not a good place to be," as though the poor man who is ill on his last legs is saved by two soldiers. If you haven't read anything else in the book, read that section.
Yep.
Excellent.
That was great.
Yeah.
I think the daughter was really interesting. I mean, here she was 17 and out doing normal things through all the air bombings. They were going to nightclubs and just having fun through all of this. And actually, Eric mentioned that she was one of his favorite characters, the daughter.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say was I was surprised that the rift between Churchill and what they thought about JFK and his opposite idea about the war and what was going on.
JFK?
Yeah, there wasn't JFK mentioned in the book.
No, it's his father.
His father. I'm sorry. Yeah, his father.
Oh, yeah,
Joe
Joe.
Kennedy.
Yeah, sorry
Joe
about that.
Kennedy was very pro-fascist. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So,
That was a side of him I didn't expect to hear about.
It's coming out more and more.
I think so.
yeah, yeah. Well, and he was made ambassador to get him out of the country because, you know, you had Lindbergh with his America First group, and there was a lot of dissension within the nation about whether we should become involved. Because as soon as Britain went to war, we declared neutrality. And that raised a lot of issues. So frankly, we almost owe it to the Japanese to, you know, to shake us into seeing both the imperial empire and the Nazi Reich as dangers to the very soul of the world.
Mm.
Yeah.
The thing that after finishing the book, what was clear was the great debt that we owe Britain, and I'm not sure, I am sure it's not appreciated, but after finishing the Splendid and the Vile, you have to see that he was the last, and Britain were the last country standing. And you mentioned America First. I think they were up to 2.5 million people, but after Pearl Harbor, they disappeared almost overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And their resilience and after the war, I was interested how long it took them to rebuild, and it took them I think it was 30 or 35 years, whereas Germany rebuilt in 20. And the question I was asking myself was, how much help did we give Britain after the war? Because they surely took the brunt of things for a long time.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, the Marshall Plan saved Europe, really, from the Russians. But it's, you know, the generation that is now coming to power throughout Europe, I'm not so sure they remember that so much. You know, Granddad remembers, I remember, but, you know, it's not within their keen. So I think we just have to have a special relationship with Britain just because of the language and the background of
Yes.
how the colonies became a country and so forth. Yeah. Some other impressions.
I would like to recommend a book by a civilian called Few Eggs and No Oranges. It's
Okay.
a diary of a woman who lived in London throughout the entire war. And it coincides so well with what was happening in the political side. And she was living the personal side. And it's just an amazing story of her life being bombed constantly. Just absolutely frightening, going to bed at night, writing in her diary, I don't know if I'll be alive in the morning, day after day after day. It's a fascinating book, and it just matches the political side so well with the personal side.
Oh, that's great. Tell us again the title.
It's called Few Eggs and No Oranges.
Few eggs and no oranges.
Egg is in EGG.
Yeah, right. And no orange.
The Diaries of Vere, Vere,
Yeah.
Hodgson, Hodgson, 1940 to 45.
Oh, wow.
Fascinating book.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Linda. That was, yeah. Okay.
And while I'm at it, there's Nella Last War. Nella was mentioned in the book as one of the people that kept a diary for the government. A lot of people were doing that.
Okay.
And she kept a diary of her life during the war. And
Huh.
then she has 2 more volumes of life after the war. But again, a nice counterpart to the political side of the war.
Right, right. Yeah, we tend to be mesmerized by the politics of everything when, if we had lived through it, you know, you'd be writing things like Veer did.
Yeah.
You know, I'm always fascinated by how Churchill, being from a prominent family, everybody knew everybody, it seemed, you know, and so even though he might not, I don't know, spend weekends at every grand castle, Downton Abbey or something like that on the weekends. So many, it's such a small group. Makes me fearful that it might be that way here. How many people? Of course, if you live in Washington and you're bumping into all these congressmen and military people and senators. Anyway, that's a different story. But Britain
Mary
would make,
Keenan,
Pardon?
didn't you have something to say to Gresh? Hi, I've got a comment, but Mary Keenan was ahead of me.
Well,
okay,
picking up on what Mr. Wood said about how long it took to recover, I was shocked to realize that they didn't take the ration off tea until 1956.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
The
Linda?
one person in the book that I wouldn't have wanted to have been was his secretary.
Oh my,
Who always had to be ready with the typewriter. Oh my goodness, the things that he put her through.
yes, yes. And it was a real typewriter. And
Right.
yeah, it's not a computer like we have. Yes.
And she was carrying it around.
All the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the way he jumped back and forth between Berlin and London,
Yes.
particularly Berlin. I learned things I did not know. He got into the minds of Hitler and his major leaders. And I had no idea that they really thought they could finish out the war in 4 days and that they were building bleachers. I'm sorry, I'll have to just let that ring twice more. They were building bleachers in Berlin to have a grand end of the war ceremony.
Yes.
I didn't know that. But one of the other interesting things, when they were going over Hitler's rationale for not bombing London, because that would, of course, give Churchill permission to bomb Berlin. And anyway, I was surprised to find that Hitler's reasoning vis-a-vis his generals was actually very well thought out and very strategic. And I was quite surprised. I mean, I totally underestimated him and thought he was, but some of his decision-making was really quite better than I expected that it would be. That was a surprise to me.
Yeah. Especially early in the war when he was at his best,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously, I bought into the stereotype of him as, this little martinet, but he, he was a skilled soldier. I mean, in World War I, he was a decorated soldier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we mustn't forget that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you can imagine how the Germans were feeling. Their armies were triumphant. I mean, once he was able to bring into the Reich Austria and then the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and so forth. He was right at that moment the greatest statesman since Bismarck, but he was insatiable, like all dictators, and he overplayed his hand, and the people that he had with him, ultimately, even though they had the best uniforms and the most forward-thinking technology for a great time, but then then everybody else started to catch up. So yeah, I like that switching back and forth, and the idea of Rudolf Hess, who was really his close confidant, taking a German fighter and flying over to Scotland, and was trying, well, I guess he was going to try to make a peace offering or get some sort of a decision made. It didn't happen, but things like that don't come forward because they're not dramatic. That's kind of dramatic, but it's in the background because he would have been disavowed anyway. So, yeah.
On Linda's path of Hitler thinking he could run over England in just a few days, Hitler thought he could get through Russia in 6 weeks. And
yeah, right. There you go.
he opened a second front on the vastest country in the world, and of course that bogged him down, and many speculate that's what really cost him any chance of world domination, because he opened a second front. And once Churchill knew that if he could only get the United States involved, he'd win. And with Russia and the United States, one of his close advisors said it's just a matter of time now. And
yes. Yeah, well, and of course the Germans thinking that their blitzkrieg into Russia would be so successful, because after all, they had run right through France without any trouble. Why wouldn't it happen there? But they didn't think also about General Winter, because just like Napoleon, it's a pretty tough thing to fight. And then Stalin's stubbornness to make a stand at Stalingrad. And after that, what would have happened? Well, and there were a couple coups against Hitler that might have happened. You might have wiped him out. Would we have dealt with a very conservative military government? I don't know. But Britain is magnificent. You would wonder if we could be so strong and staunch, and we would have to be led by somebody like a Churchill,
How do you think Churchill would handle the current COVID problem we have? I think he would have taken care of it much better than the current guys may have stepped up to the plate later. I think he would have been right there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you wonder in the next war, whatever that conflagration will be, how much biology will be part of the situation.
That's true. Yeah.
Why not just send in a COVID missile into the center of Washington and just let it work its magic,
Wouldn't take long.
No.
I understand that Boris Johnson, the current prime minister,
Yes.
is a big fan of Churchill. How would you compare Boris Johnson to Churchill?
Oh, geez. Well, he certainly has none of the eloquence. His persona is, he looks like a disheveled workman most of the time with his hairdo. I don't think he compares well at all. Although, the Conservatives just won big victories in England. England proper. Scotland's another problem. Yeah, well, but Churchill, he was almost, and didn't he say it somewhere in here that he felt he was almost raised throughout his life for this moment when he took the responsibility of becoming prime minister, that all that had gone before prepared him for that.
And yet he wasn't the choice.
Right. Well, he was not necessarily a big popular figure in Britain anyway, because he had the Gallipoli thing on his, that was part of his legacy. He was always outspoken. He had jumped parties, political parties, a couple times. Yeah. So, and does anybody know much about who was the guy in the House of Lords who could have been prime minister? Halifax. I don't know Lord Halifax, what his persona was, but he deferred to Churchill because he felt that the prime minister should come from the Commons and not the Lords, which I thought was pretty gracious on his part. But
That I would, and your question of how would you compare Boris Johnson, it reminds me of when I was with Raytheon at a missile show in Washington, D.C. And the things got quiet. This little short, pudgy guy came up to the booth, and he was part of the German V2 effort in World War II.
Huh.
And so we chatted a while, and I said, you know, gee, to me, it was always amazing that we got half your scientists and all the drawings, and we couldn't make the V2s work for 2 years here in the United States. And he looked at me, and I've never forgot the comment. He said, never confuse peacetime and wartime. Never confuse the two. And so
yeah,
if a president is a peacetime president, he can never rise to the Churchill or Lincoln or Roosevelt stature. It's just, I don't think it can be done.
yeah. Which brings to mind immediately Harry Truman. He was
Yes.
kept in the dark as vice president by FDR, and all of a sudden FDR just passes on, and boom, hey, we've got an atomic bomb we've developed. Shall we use it? All sorts of things to deal with, and he rose to the occasion, I would say.
Yes.
So that's a good point, Jim. Yeah, war or some sort of disaster really focuses your attention, and which sends shivers up my spine when you think about the prior president being confronted with an incident in, off Taiwan. What would happen?
Yes.
I would hate to go there.
Right.
But World War II is such a magnificent war in that there are really good guys and they're bad guys. And fortunately, we were able to help the good guys win. But look what we had to do. We allied with one of the Hitler and Stalin, to my mind, are, of the same cloth. I mean, Stalin starved the Ukrainians. He moved the German population because he didn't trust it, of course. Executions were the name of the day, name of the game. But hey, any port in a storm during the World War. And so the Russians really, they were magnificent and heroic in their own way. What did they lose? 20 million people?
Yes.
51 million.
Just amazing. So it's good to have books like Larson's here that showed not only the upper echelons of what was going on in high government circles, and of course it was as high as it could be with Churchill, but the everyday life that went on about them. Teenagers being teenagers. I mean, you can hardly, fortunately, they were in Britain. If they were in Eastern Europe and they were Jewish, it was a whole different story. They were being sent to concentration camps and things like this. But life does go on, and you know, you just hope you survive the day to day, and if you do, you can live to write about it. And if not, maybe you've done your part to, you know, to help move the nation forward in whatever the crisis at hand is.
It was marvelous that so many people kept diaries. I think the government encouraged everybody to keep a wartime diary, right? Because the author had so much rich material to draw from. And it was like a novel. I mean, we got to know daughter Mary, and we got to know the private secretary, Stockdale, through their diaries. And, you know, he lets on a little at a time, you know, the love affairs and everything. People don't do that anymore. It would be impossible to write that kind of a book today because people don't write down their thoughts. But how absolutely wonderful that day-to-day human, just average life record was so richly maintained.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of like the way, you know, Gresh mentioned all of the wonderful passages that are all the way through the book. And I was taken back by the fact of how Erik came up with his title, The Splendid and the Vile.
Yeah.
It was from Secretary John Colville, who was watching the bombs from his window.
Yeah.
He says how he was struck by how spectacular the night was. The searchlights were leading in the sky, the explosions. And then he said, never was there such a contrast of natural splendor and human vileness.
Yes.
And Erik Larson picked up on that, and that's where the title came from. But I'm with you and everyone else. I'm not a big like to read history books, especially of the wars. But this was a story that really took me in, even though it was a large volume of information. It did read like a novel, and I was really taken by how well he put together everything, and it kept my interest. And I'm a hard one to sell on any World War I or World War II books. So, Gresh, thank you for taking that on.
Okay.
It was a big job, Gresh. Yeah.
Well, but there's not a book written about those wars that I wouldn't read gladly. Yeah. And so Larson, as I said, I'm going to go back and read the one about the Lusitania. Evidently, one of the other ones that was about the World's Fair.
Oh, The Devil in the White City.
Yeah. Now wasn't Tom Hanks somebody bought the rights to it and was thinking to make it.
That was so good. That was my introduction to Erik Larson.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And Erik Larson wrote In the Garden of the Beasts about Germany turning.
That's right.
Which is sort of a prelude.
And how some Americans were drawn to that side, at least to begin with. Yes, that's an excellent book too.
Oh, yeah. It would appeal to the 78 million out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. He's a magnificent writer, and it's really great to see a wordsmith of his ability. So I would recommend it. I'm glad we picked it.
Me too.
The Devil in the White City is also the first book I read, but I will say he's getting better as an author.
Mhm.
He's just improving and finding interesting new tidbits.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he also wrote about the Galveston hurricane and Isaac Storm. That was one of his also.
That was good.
It's an excellent
Never
book.
read that.
Yeah. 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 So for somebody to take, I read one of the critiques would turn his whole book upside down and say, oh, he didn't say anything new, and he just told these stories about people. And you know, I just couldn't believe that this guy would say that, because that's the whole basis of the book and what enriches the whole message that is sent there.
It's the stories that make it, the way he presented all those characters.
Oh,
Yes,
yes, oh,
yeah.
yes.
Just magnificent. So I hope we have some good ones like this for next year too. Is
Sounds
that
good.
lead into you, Sue?
That sounds like
That's
a
a good lead
segue.
in, Sue.
That sounds like a segue.
Thank you, Gresh. That was
Great.
excellent.
Gresh,
Thank you so
you did it.
much.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you,
Gresh. You did a
Gresh.
great job.
As
Yep,
always.
nice job.
Okay, I'm gonna leave for this.
Very good. So, okay, so we won't be offended if you don't want to stay, but those of you who want to stay and talk about some books for next year, we'll get into that right away. I did send out a list of ones that I had collected from people have written me notes through the year, and some of them I put on the list because I personally had heard the author of several of them, and they seemed really interesting. One of the books that I had put on the list was a follow-up from last year. 2 or 3 people had mentioned they'd like to read a book about Hedy Lamarr and her scientific side as opposed to her actress side. And coincidentally, about 2 months ago, I got a note from an old friend catching me up on what she was doing during the pandemic. And one of the things she was doing was reading a Hedy Lamarr book. And she recommended it very highly. And that's why I added that to the list. So I think what I'd like to do is kind of open it up and see if there are any other suggestions to add to the list, any comments about the ones that are here, so we can kind of narrow this down. I'd like to get it down to about 10 or 12 that we can vote on later, so that we can have our 5 books for next year. So I don't know who would like to jump in, but I know Mary Keenan, you usually have read most of these books.
I've only read a couple. I read Lincoln on the Verge, which is wonderful, about Lincoln's trip to Washington in avoiding assassins on the way. If you haven't read it, that is superb. Spying on the South is excellent. I like Hedy Lamarr. I thought what looked interesting was 1919, the year that changed America. Racism, suffrage, labor issues, and prohibition.
I'm sorry, what was that last one?
1919.
The 1919 one. Okay, yeah.
That looked good. I read Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers. It gets a little tedious.
Okay, that's good to know.
I mean, it's not an easy read.
Okay.
And I read a review that Cross of Snow is slow going.
Okay, that's good to know.
That's good.
Yeah, I listened to the author, and that's why I kind of put that on there, because the author of Cross of Snow, Nicholas Basbanes, I think is how you pronounce his name. He really promoted the book, and it sounded interesting, even though I hadn't read it. So that's kind of why I put Cross of Snow on there, because he made it sound interesting. So anyway, it was for consideration.
Mm.
And then I also had attended a lot of lectures by Richard Bell, who's done Stolen, the 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery. And he's an excellent author talk as well. So that was another reason I put Stolen on there, because he is really fascinating as far as a narrator goes. And it's an interesting story, looks like, too.
Okay, anyone else familiar with any of these books and be able to tell us whether they're good, bad, or indifferent? Marcia, have you read any of them?
Yes.
You're on mute, Marcia.
Marcia? You-
Lincoln on the Verge and Spying on the South. I've read both of them. The Hedy Lamarr book sounds interesting to me. Maybe the 1919.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'm kind of interested in the very first one, the epic rivalry of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster. Those, I bet secretly they really were rivals. I'll bet they purported to be great friends and colleagues, probably loved to tear each other up the back, you know. So I wouldn't mind learning more about those giants.
Mary Keenan's description has sold me on that one as well.
Aha, okay. Linda, what do you think about Night of the Assassin? You arranged for the author to come and talk about that, and it sounded pretty
Well,
good.
yes. The author spoke to a packed house of 100 people at the Lexington Veterans, and we they couldn't get enough, and people were texting and chatting right online. I've just bought your book while you were talking. So 6 people couldn't even wait and bought the book. So it was extremely popular, and several people more went out and bought the book, and the author was kind enough to send some book labels.
Yep.
And we said, if anybody bought the book, let us know. We'll send you an autographed book label. And we got several people who said, yes, I bought the book.
Including me.
What is the subject of
I
that?
beg your pardon. Oh, okay. It turns out that in 1943, we know this is history, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin had a, quote, secret meeting in Tehran, in Iran, for a, in the war, to decide what was going to happen. But it was not secret. Hitler got wind of it, and he sent his most trusted assassin, who put together a crack team, ahead of time to Tehran to assassinate the 3 biggies. He knew the war was lost, but he figured if new people would come in to replace these, he could get better terms of surrender for the war. So the book, it's a true story. It's a documentary, but it's written and it reads like a thriller novel. The Secret Service agent in charge of protecting the president, turns out he was a policeman from Billings, Montana, but he turned out he was the right man in the right place at the right time. Learned that it was very possible there were Nazis in town. and he, it's a race for time, race against time. Will he uncover them in time to stop the plot? And I mean, the Nazi team are so darn smart. They get access and they're almost there, and they almost get there, and they almost make it, but they don't, because everybody survives.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Yeah. And it's really cool. Plus you learn a lot about, historical stuff in Tehran in 1943, and how once again, Hitler did some fairly strategic stuff.
Mhm.
I'd put that on the list for next year.
Mhm.
Okay. Did anyone have any other suggestions that we can also consider?
I liked the Noble Volunteers about the British soldiers during the American Revolution.
Okay,
I have read very little about that and I know practically nothing about them.
And Don Haggis, Sue, hadn't he come to one of our Cronin lectures?
Mhm.
possibly.
He came to something.
He did come to something, didn't he?
He
He
may
did.
have.
Because I remember hearing his lecture.
Yeah, and I heard it too from some other venue, maybe like the Mass Historical Society. I think they may have had him. And he was really very good and he's local, which is a good thing.
Yeah, well, the Cary Library did one recently.
Oh,
That's why I
maybe that
put it
was
on a
it.
list. Yeah,
Maybe that was it, Sue, the Cary
Yeah.
Library.
yeah,
But he was
Yeah.
very interesting. He had a great slide presentation that
Yep,
was
yep.
really good.
yep.
And the book, you know, it's not a long book, but it's got good facts in it, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other one, let's see, did I
Nan-
put it, where did I
Nancy-
put it?
Nancy has a comment.
I have a
Okay,
comment.
yes, Nancy.
I read the reviews of that on Goodreads and a lot of people called it very dull.
What, Noble
Oh.
Volunteers?
Yeah, Noble
Yeah.
Volunteers.
He may be a better speaker than he is a.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true. He was a good speaker, but maybe his book is boring.
Okay, well, we take that into consideration. Take a look at some more reviews. Okay. The Finest Hours about the US Coast Guard sea rescue, that was also, I think, a Cary lecture, not Cary, the Cary Library presentation. Michael Tugias is actually someone that we know. He wrote about the Quabbin Reservoir, and we actually took a field trip out there. And so this, he talked about two tankers that sank almost at the very same time off of Cape Cod, and how the US Coast Guard rescued them and everything. And it sounded kind of exciting. I don't know how much detail they go into about, you know, Coast Guard stuff, but the story itself, he presented it quite well.
It's a short read too. It's only what, 204 pages?
Yeah, actually, the book that he talked about was actually for teenagers that he adapted from this book. So, but the story is obviously the same.
And it'd be
Okay.
great to have him come.
He probably would. He's not too far away.
Yeah.
Okay, so usually we have some last minute additions, but I'm not hearing any. No last minute
Well,
additions.
There's a new book out. I don't know anything about it, but it's gotten rave reviews from the New York Times. Juneteenth. Let me see if I can find it.
Annette Gordon-Jones.
Pardon?
It's by Annette Gordon-Jones.
That's right. That's right.
She's the one who wrote The Hemmings of Monticello. And it's about growing up in Texas, sort of memoir, sort of history. It has gotten good reviews.
What's the name of it? Juneteenth?
Yes.
Juneteenth. It's about Texas, the African Americans, or a group of African Americans who are slaves in Texas and did not realize, were not told about the Civil War, the outcome of the Civil War. Further than that, I don't know.
Well, there was a whole article in the New York Times book review this past Sunday about it. So, and of course, it was featured on the front page. So
Did it sound interesting, Gresh?
Yeah, to an extent. It wouldn't be my top choice. I think some of these others, like the Night of the Assassins immediately attracts me for many reasons.
Thought it might.
Here it is from the Times on Sunday.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a look at it. We're not making any commitments right now,
Right,
so
yeah, you're just getting.
just getting some ideas, so.
Only
Okay, are we done?
Only 144 pages.
Yeah. I know that's attractive to a lot of you, so.
Yeah.
So, okay, then I think we're all set. So I will put together a list to send out for folks to vote on, and we'll pick our top 5, and we'll pick some dates. Hopefully, at least some of them, we might actually be together in person.
Oh.
We might even get to eat.
Wow. What was that like?
Yeah, really, really. So. Okay, Joan, do you have anything else?
No, it's been a great year, and we've had some great.
We
books
managed.
and
We managed it.
We did.
We did it.
Got a couple of authors, which was great.
Yeah, yeah. So, Sarah, if you're still there, do you have anything else to add?
Nope, I'm hanging out on the phone because my computer froze. So I'm
Oh, okay.
trying not to,
Uh-oh.
Okay.
do too
I'll
much
just
over
put,
here.
I'll just put in a plug for the series of 3 talks, 3 separate talks on the subject, general subject of mid-century modern. The first of which is tomorrow night, which is a general overview of mid-century modern in Lexington, and I'm the speaker.
All right.
But there are 3, 2 others, one on mid-century modern fabrics, I believe, and one on a restoration edition on with an architect on a house in Peacock Farm.
Yep, Susan Ward, you may remember her from Lextopia.
Mm-hmm.
And she is a textile historian, and she is going to be talking a little bit more about the design. Oh, what was the store? My brain is
Marimekko?
getting them all mixed up
you.
here.
Yes, Marimekko.
Design
yeah.
research, that was it. And how they were the main importer of Marimekko fashions.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone have a great summer, and I hope it won't be too much longer before we can do this stuff in person. So
Let's hope.
happy reading.
Okay.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you all. Thanks
Good
again,
summer,
Gresh.
everyone. Stay healthy,
Good
wealthy,
night.
and wise.
Good night.